So an outline of what we're going to cover in this talk. First of all, we got to get some background on fertilizer, and a lot of you may know quite a bit about fertilizers, but in case you don't, this will kind of catch everybody up. So we're going to look over the definition, the history, the transition to synthetic. Somebody was saying something. Okay, transition to synthetic fertilizers. We're going to focus in on nitrogenous fertilizers, look at ammonia synthesis, the Haber process, which is a very, very famous process, and then get into the details of the fertilizer shortage. Okay, so according to Wikipedia, the definition of fertilizer is any material of natural or synthetic origin that is applied to soil or to plant tissues to supply plant materials. So fertilizers are distinct from liming materials or other non-nutrient soil amendments. So like liming materials would be something like calcium oxide, which you would use for adjusting the pH. That's not qualified as a fertilizer. A fertilizer is more like a plant food, a nutrient soil amendment. Many sources of fertilizers exist, both natural and industrially produced in modern agriculture. So our focus is on three main macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, plus additional supplements like rock dust for micronutrients. And of course, application, as you're familiar with, are by dry or pelletized forms or liquid forms. So historically, the natural fertilizers would be things like compost, like rotting, like vegetation matter, animal manure, human manure, which was problematic because then the microbes that might be disease causing in the human manure would get recycled back into the plants, and then people would eat the plants again. So human manure is not really a good idea, but it has been used. Harvested or mining type of minerals, crop rotations, so that you're getting into new fertile land that maybe hasn't been depleted of its nutrients. And then byproducts of human nature industries like fish processing waste or blood meal from animal slaughter. So it's believed that Neolithic man probably did use fertilizers. And the first fertilizer that was produced by chemical processes was an ordinary superphosphate that was made in the early 19th century. And what they did was they treated bones with sulfuric acid, and then coprolites and phosphate rocks soon replaced the bones as the phosphorus source. And coprolites are basically fossilized dung. That's what that is. So if somebody calls you a coprolite, that's not complimentary. Potassium fertilizer industry started in Germany in 1861, and then here in North America during World War I. So then there was a transition to synthetic fertilizers beginning in the 19th century, when the agricultural industry began to be really developed around synthetic fertilizers. This was huge, because it really transformed the whole global food system, because it allowed larger scale industrial agriculture and it enabled larger crop yields. The nitrogen fixing chemical processes such as the Haber process led to a boom in the use of natural nitrogen containing fertilizers. And an increase in nitrogen use was 800% between the years of 1961 and 2019. And the result of this was that there was a greater than 30% increase per capita in productivity of conventional food systems. And they referred to this at that time as the Green Revolution. Now, no talk about fertilizers would be complete without talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority. We're from the government and we're here to help, and they really did help that time. So in 1933, the TVA was formed as part of FDR's New Deal because the Tennessee Valley around the Tennessee River was really adversely affected by the Great Depression. So the government wanted to do some things to kind of shore up that area economically, and they wanted to put in flood protection. They wanted to have the TVA have a national responsibility to increase the efficiency of fertilizer manufacture and use. And they also set the TVA up as a utility, which it is to this day. So greater than 75% of the fertilizer produced in the United States is by processes developed by the TVA. So you can see why they are, deemed so important to the fertilizer industry. And then here's a whole list of the TVA-induced fertilizers and fertilizer intermediates. You can see a lot of different phosphates, nitrate, and all those various things. Okay, so what is nitrogen fixation? Well, what you have to realize is that nitrogen in the form of N2 that's floating around in the air is a very, very stable molecule because it has a triple covalent bond. So it's the two nitrogen atoms are held together very tightly. But in order for the nitrogen to benefit the plants, you've got to get that bond broken. Okay, so that's the point of this. So nitrogen fixation is defined as any process that causes free atmospheric nitrogen to combine chemically with other elements to form more reactive nitrogen compounds such as ammonia, nitrates, or nitrites. And these processes may occur like through atmospheric, like lightning, industrial, or biological processes. Now, looking at the history of nitrogen fixation, one of the main ones is ammonia synthesis. Now, the use of nitrogenous fertilizers, as we mentioned before, is well established by the early 1900s. Now, at that time, the principal sources were sodium nitrate from Chile and the byproduct ammonium sulfite from destructive distillation of coal, which was the town gas production. And I'm sure some of you that are at least as old as I am remember that town gas was sent around by piping systems to people's homes, much the same way that natural gas is here now. And the town gas had carbon monoxide, methane, and hydrogen as the main combustibles in that gas. But the problem was that the supply couldn't keep up with the demand from those sources due to population increase and the development of alternative uses. In particular, the explosive industry was using a lot of ammonia. So the early industrial nitrogen fixation being developed during, around 1900 to 1920, by about 1910, there were actually two commercial processes developed. And those were the cyanamid process and the electric arc process. So let's take a look at those two processes. So for you, those of you that like chemistry, like I do, here are the chemical steps in making cyanamid or using the cyanamid route to get to ammonia. And basically, so you're starting out with lime, which is calcium oxide, combining with carbon, which probably is coal would be your source. Now notice this is run at extremely high temperature, 2000 degrees centigrade, to go to calcium carbide and carbon monoxide. Then starting with calcium carbide and combining with nitrogen, and then going to, let's see, I gotta get my nomenclature right here. Okay, calcium cyanamide in carbon, then calcium cyanamide with water reacting to form ammonia finally and calcium carbonate. Notice that this second reaction is running at 1000 degrees centigrade. So these reactions are very energy intensive. So then the industrial cyanamide processes started with their first plant commissioned in Italy in 1906, followed by other plants built in Germany and here in the United States. We had the German production up to 140,000 tons per year by and I can't see my slide there very well. Let's see. Anyway, I guess maybe you guys can read it. And the process was inefficient, as I mentioned before, due to the high energy use because of the high temperatures that those reactions had to occur at. And so you can see it was 230 gigajoules per ton of nitrogen. Now, when we turn to the electric arc process, they had used cheap energy in Norway in 1905, and I assume that was probably hydroelectric power. And then also here in our country in 1917, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink. In this process, air was passed through an electric arc that was up at a temperature of 3,000 degrees centigrade. So we're talking about an even much higher temperature to run this process. So basically you can see the oxygen and the nitrogen from the air going to nitrogen oxide. Now this process, as I mentioned, because of this high temperature, is also inefficient in terms of energy consumption at 720 gigajoules per ton of nitrogen. So that's like over 3 times what the cyanamid process was. So meanwhile, BASF in Germany was working on the direct synthesis of ammonia from hydrogen and nitrogen, which was come up with by Fritz Haber, which they called the Haber process. And as I said, this is a very famous process. So basically, here's the chemical reaction: nitrogen gas reacting with hydrogen, which the source of the hydrogen could be natural gas, or naphtha, or coal, and then those would form ammonia. Now, initially, the Germans kept this secret because I guess they started realizing they were onto something special here, which they were. They used coal at first as their source of hydrogen, and then later the natural gas and naphtha to produce, the hydrogen then to react to form the ammonia. And people may say, well, what is naphtha? Because a lot of people maybe have not heard of naphtha. So here's the definition. It's a flammable oil containing various hydrocarbons obtained by the dry distillation of organic substances such as coal, shale, or petroleum. And they specify dry distillation because a lot of times in various processes like this, they add steam, but this is a dry distillation. Okay. Anyway, so higher efficiency processes were developed over time. Now, one of the reasons that the Haber process was such a big deal was not only that they could produce fertilizer, which was important worldwide, but also that much scientific knowledge was developed around improving this Haber process. So Fritz Haber determined the equilibrium constant for the synthesis reaction in 1904. Now, you may remember from your freshman chemistry courses, or not, that basically what you have is the equilibrium constant is equal to the concentration of the products over the concentrations of the reactants, okay, multiplied together. And you take the coefficients from your reaction equation and you put that up as your exponent, okay. This, of course, would be 1, and that would be 3, okay. So that's how he through experimental means, he figured out that this was the case. All right. So then they conducted experiments at 1020 degrees centigrade at 1 atmosphere pressure over finely divided iron catalyst. And in 1906, Nernst applied his new heat theory, which later became known as the third law of thermodynamics, to this synthesis reaction. And from the Heat's reaction, he found that he could calculate the equilibrium constant at any temperature. And then after having all of this knowledge, then they realized that the conversion could be improved at high pressure. Now, if you apply Le Chatelier's principle, which that says if a stress is applied to a reaction mixture at equilibrium, the net reaction goes in the direction that relieves the stress. Okay, so you see here that there's 1 mole of nitrogen, 3 moles of hydrogen. on this side, and you've got only 2 moles of ammonia on this side. So it's going, the reaction is going from 4 moles to 2 moles. So since that's the lesser number of moles on that side, when you put this under pressure, okay, it's going to go more to the ammonia. Okay, so that's why they realized that they could improve the conversion at high pressure. Okay, so Fritz Haber developed a catalyst based on osmium. And in 1909, he built a semi-technical plant to produce small amounts of ammonia. And then BASF scaled it up at the plant at Opau to produce 30 tons a day of ammonia, and commissioned that one in September of 1913. Most notably, Carl Bosch was the project leader, and I think everybody probably recognizes that name, Bosch. That's because his dad and his uncle started out producing spark plugs, and set up the Bosch company that we know today as the ones that actually produce kitchen appliances. We have a dishwasher that's a very nice, quiet appliance that's Bosch in our kitchen. So I'm sure a lot of you have Bosch appliances in your homes as well. Anyway, so this was the first time a plant had been designed to run at such high temperatures and pressures. So they had to design specialized instruments and valves to be able to withstand those high temperatures and pressures. So that was another kind of landmark accomplishment because of this improvements that they made to this Haber process. So then BASF investigated over 2,500 catalytic formulations in order to optimize their catalyst. So they came up with an alkali promoted magnetite, which included oxides of copper and aluminum. So it's important to note, especially for the case of our group, is that the production of nitrogenous fertilizer can be done by green technology. So currently, the Haber process is carried out by the reaction of nitrogen with natural gas. However, the natural gas could be potentially replaced by green hydrogen, that is, hydrogen produced by using renewable energy such as solar or wind energy. So now we'll finally get to the fertilizer shortage, because we've got the background that we can kind of understand better what's going on and the significance of it. What I did was I listened to 3 videos online by the Health Ranger Report at Brighteon. This first one was recorded November 4th of last year. And Mike Adams, the host, said that extreme weather had already disrupted last year's harvest. And the shortage of energy worldwide, but especially in China, where power was being turned off to various industries because they were so short on energy, was happening largely due to these 2 things: decommissioning of the fossil fuel power plants and decommissioning of the nuclear power plants. Now, this is all well and good if you have other kinds of power plants to replace them, but unfortunately, we don't have enough power plants of other types to replace the amount of energy that's produced by these 2. So we're rapidly getting ourselves into a huge energy shortage worldwide. And this is pure stupidity. I'm sorry, but this just shouldn't be happening. And anyway, we'll get to that in the discussion, I'm sure, a lot more. So many in Brazil can only afford either food or energy, but not both. In the Philippines, the prices of fuel has increased 40% in 3 weeks back at that time. Mike mentioned that the developed countries will feel the pain too. And then the methane gas prices, I say methane, but he means natural gas. These gas prices have doubled. And remember that natural gas is used not only to produce fertilizer, but it's also used to dry crops. So it has huge usage for food production. Now, the Europeans will be or have been facing energy rationing with the cold winter. Fertilizer factories have been blown up and trains derailed by a chain of saboteurs global network. Now, this is something you probably have not heard on the mainstream media very much, but there was a train derailed with hydrochloric acid in Minnesota, and hydrochloric acid is used for fertilizer production. There was a train derailed that had 47 cars full of fertilizer. All right, so that's a huge amount. And one of the commentators who has a career involved in this field said that he had seen more derailments with fertilizer this year than during his entire career. And about 45% of the supply of fertilizer in the UK has been shut down. And the reason for that is that the price of natural gas has gone up so much. You realize that, I'm sure everybody realizes that Russia supplies a lot of the natural gas to Europe. So these fossil fuel prices are just simply too high to make fertilizer cost effective. China is stopping phosphate fertilizer export until June of this year. And we also have, and this probably you haven't heard about this on the mainstream media either, and that is that transportation and delivery issues have come up, such as 91,000 truck drivers have been pulled off the road in the past year for failing drug tests. And half of those were tests for marijuana use. Okay, so what are the effects of the fertilizer shortage? Well, less fertilizer causes reduced crop yields, and a lack of fertilizer will result in the starvation of 3.8 billion people. Back in 1896, a man by the name of Alfred Henry Lewis essentially said that every civilization is only 9 meals away from anarchy. In other words, people are not very happy when they're hungry, and they start rioting. So another Health Ranger report given on March 7th, so just here recently, was entitled this, and this is a pretty scary title. Global crop collapse, now a certainty. Widespread famine to plague planet Earth from 2022 to 2024. It is set in motion and cannot be stopped. Economic sanctions to cause global crop collapse, widespread famine. So looking at that crop collapse, with no food, most people will die in 47 days. There's been a major cut in global food production due to war in Ukraine and the West's economic sanctions. Keep in mind that Russia has 30% of the world's natural resources, and that Russia plus Ukraine produces about 25% of the world's wheat crop. Russia and Hungary are cutting off all fertilizer exports, and around 4 or 5 billion people need fossil fuel-based fertilizers to have enough food to survive. And a large portion of this fertilizer comes from Russia. So in particular, Russia provides potash, which is a source of potassium, phosphate, and nitrogen-based fertilizers, about 500 million tons per year, or about 13% of the global total. Russia imports nearly all of its seeds, including potato tubers, and particularly the seeds are coming from Dutch and American sources. The Russian people will starve as a result of the West's sanctions. Food prices have jumped by 20.7% in February alone. Food prices have increased so much that it's anticipated that Americans' food bills will increase by $1,000 per month, and the quality of the food may also be affected. The cost of nitrogen-based fertilizer is up 300%. And there's been a double in food price due to the increase in the price of diesel. And so you have to think the way diesel is used, like for running trucks for deliveries, farm tractors, etc. 71% of the US winter wheat was hit by a drought. Flooding in China delayed a third of the wheat crop from being planted in 2021. And in the US, it's anticipated that we will see food riots, and we will also see flash mobs looting grocery stores, because we've already seen flash mobs looting other types of stores, but it's going to be grocery stores in the future. So on another Health Ranger report, even more recently on March 9th, Mike said that Russia provides a quarter of the world's ammonia, 17% of the potash, 14% of the urea, and 10% of the phosphates. Belarus provides 21% of the world's potash. So you can see between Russia and Belarus, that's 38% of the world's potash right there. External sources are required in order to bring new fertilizer into any given cropland. That's a given. About 4 or 5 billion people are dependent on synthetic fertilizers, as was mentioned before. And probably at least 1 to 2 billion people will face starvation due to the war in Ukraine and economic sanctions, as Don was mentioning earlier. You know, it's a very big issue. So we want to consider the percent of income that people are having to spend on food. So if that percentage gets up to 30, that starts making people nervous. If they're having to spend 30% of their income on food, that's pretty bad. But then by the time they get up to 40% of their income on food, the food riots will begin, and history has shown us that. So just to review, for photosynthesis, we know that we need light, usually sunlight, unless you're indoors, and then you can have, you know, specialized lights, right? Plus water, plus carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a very important molecule for growing food, and without it in the atmosphere, all plants would die. There would be no food. And carbon dioxide is also often the limiting substance in greenhouses, to the extent that some growers even have their own carbon dioxide generators. So it's been observed that if you use more carbon dioxide, you can produce more food. And NASA images have shown that higher levels of carbon dioxide make some previously arid land green and productive. And Bill Gates wants to blow sulfate particles into the atmosphere. They call that geoengineering, to block the sunlight, because he's worried about global warming, I guess. That's not a good idea, because we need the sunlight for photosynthesis. Just mentioning it. Okay, now, all right. So the source of this is an Amazon review of one of Klaus Schwab's books on the Great Reset. And he's talking about at least 4 billion useless eaters. Okay, now who are the useless eaters? Well, I'm a useless eater, and you're all useless eaters, because I don't think we have any of the global elite in our group here. Okay, so anyway, he's saying at least 4 billion useless eaters shall be eliminated by the year 2050 by means of limited wars. That's going on right now. Organized epidemics of fatal rapid acting diseases. Yeah, we've had that the last couple of years, haven't we? And starvation yet to come, I guess. Energy, food, and water shall be kept at subsistence levels for the non-elite. That's us, guys. Starting with the white populations of Western Europe and North America, and spreading to other races. The population of Canada, Western Europe, and the United States will be decimated more rapidly than on other continents, until the world's population reaches a manageable level of 1 billion, of which 500 million will consist of Chinese and Japanese races, selected because they are people who have been regimented for centuries and who are accustomed to obeying authority without question. From time to time, there shall be artificially contrived food, water, and water shortages and medical care to remind the masses that their very existence depends on the goodwill of the Committee of 300. So there were a lot of comments throughout. There were like about 3,000 comments on one of Klaus Schwab's books, and people were talking about how arrogant he was, and about him referring to all of us as useless eaters. And I don't know, I don't think he's a guy you'd enjoy sitting down having a beer with. That's all I can say. So what are the solutions to these problems? Well, and these solutions are for us as individuals. I would recommend that we all stock up on the food basics, especially canned and dry foods with longer shelf life. Store water, obtain barrels to catch rainwater off your roof, and obtain water filters and water treatments, such as just a regular bleach can be used as a water treatment. Grow your own food if you possibly can. Some of you are in apartments, so you don't have your own land out back, but you know, there are a lot of community gardens. I don't know what they're doing in that way in Madison, but here in Sun Prairie, we've got a very delightful community garden available to all. And then it would also be a good idea to store seeds and fertilizer. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to Mike Adams of the Health Ranger Report for the information that he provided. And I'm ready for questions.
I'd like to jump in and use my prerogative as a co-host to ask, I think, a very essential question to this. And that is, how much are we really dependent upon fertilizer? For example, we've all know about rotation of crops here in Wisconsin, and it's very popular to rotate corn, for example, with soybeans. And the soybeans are thought to add nitrogen to the soil. So my question to you is, how much do farmers who rotate their crops, how much do they depend upon additional fertilizer? That I think is key, because corn is very easy to store. It's in a lot of silos all around Wisconsin and a lot of the rest of the country. So can we manage this with soybeans and corn? That question is to you, Lee.
Okay, if it's to me, well, basically we're going to still be able to have a crop, but it will be a much smaller crop, if you don't have fertilizer. And I think, if I go back in my slides here, let's see here.
But I don't see your slides relating to
okay, yeah, they popped out. I guess I'm going to have to go back.
The basic question I'm asking you or anybody is, how much do we have to have if we're, Wisconsin is an agricultural state, and we're very dedicated to corn, and everybody that I know of practically rotates their crops. Even go out to walk on the Pope Farm nearby, you see all kinds of crop rotation, and I just see it everywhere I look in Wisconsin. And my question is, if you rotate your crops, how much do you have to have artificial fertilizer?
Well, see, here's the thing, is this kind of quantifies it. Basically, we have about 8 billion people on the earth right now. Is that correct number?
Yeah.
About that.
Yeah. Okay. And so in the Health Ranger Report, he said 5 billion people need fossil fuel-based fertilizers to have enough food to survive. So what you're saying there is, basically about 2/3 almost of the crops won't come up if you don't use the fossil-based fuel-based fertilizers. You're going to lose about 2/3 of your crop, Richard. That's the answer.
Can I say something, Lee?
Sure.
Please do. Yeah.
One of the things about crop rotation, you already have to be trained in it. You have to have enough land that you can let some lie fallow. And we have increased production by utilizing more of the land, on a regular basis by substituting these unnatural fertilizers. So the world has become very dependent. And I think the United States is still quite dependent. It's true that we could transition to more natural ways of fertilizing, but we're talking about the world. Now, one of the things that I did want to ask you, Lee, is how reliable are the predictions, not so much about how much ammonia is being used and all those things, but in terms of the starvation and these kinds of things. How reliable in the past has this ranger group been in their predictions?
Well, I've been following him for about a year. He seems to be fairly reliable, and I kind of checked up on, where he was saying certain percentages of, wheat or certain percentages of fertilizer. I checked with Google and it matched up, but probably he got his information from Google. So I think what happens, Dottie, is that everybody refers back to Google these days. We're so Google dependent that if Google's correct, then we know the right stuff. And if Google's not correct, well, I don't know where else we get our source from. Do you?
No.
Well, if I can add another comment, it's sure going to make kelp burger is a popular item because kelp doesn't require any artificial fertilizer. And for that matter, hamburgers shouldn't be too bad either because so many of our cattle are feeding off the range. And I don't think those prairies are being fertilized. So we shouldn't be, if you think of all the fish we eat and all the corn that's still in storage and all the kelp burgers we could eat, I don't think we're going to starve. But yes, there are parts of the world that will. And it seems to me that possibly Eastern Europe and Russia might suffer more than most.
I think you're right, Richard, and I think we're very fortunate living in the bread basket of the world right here in the Midwest. We couldn't be in a better location than we are.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to worry about water. I mean, water,
right. We don't have to worry about water. That's right.
And the other thing that strikes me, though, is nitrogen fixing bacteria and lightning. Can't they add quite a bit of nitrogen back into the soil? I don't know, break those triple bonds of nitrogen gas. I mean, I think there's things there that they're underestimated. The other thing, based on Dottie's presentation last week, boy, this article that Rich sent around about the rainforest being decimated by large corporation, by small people and then the large corporation. That's just going to put pressure on the rainforest like you can't believe. The things you're saying here, the pressure is just going to be through the roof. And everything you're saying is just global. We cannot stop global warming. It's just going to accelerate. That's all I'm getting out of this. It's just not stoppable. I mean, it's very depressing.
Well, I mean, but also realize that we do need a lot of carbon dioxide, as I said in the presentation, but also you were talking and Richard was talking too about, maybe having more legumes planted because that does put more nitrogen back into the soil. And maybe Dottie knows more about, or maybe some of the others of you as well, about cover crops. Can anybody tell us about cover crops? It's a farmer. I'm not a farmer, so I thought maybe some of you might be.
I grew up on a farm. I mean, I don't know. Cover crops it goes along with rotation. It kind of builds up the soil, creates minimizes erosion, or both wind and water. But the other thing that strikes, I'm going to switch here a little bit. These corporate farms that are out there, they're going to put pressure right away on the public. I mean, they're going to feel this. The corporate farms are going to feel this immediately.
Oh yeah.
And they are going to, that's what's going to really respond first, if you ask me. And they are taking over all the agriculture and a lot of the agriculture. And maybe we have to go backwards to the a medium-sized small farmer or something. I don't know.
I'd like to see that.
This is Rika. I can speak somewhat to cover crops. I'm not a farmer, but I have a large community garden and I plant cover crops. I plant buckwheat and it not only enriches the soil, I always take a big swatch of I have about a 60 by 25 area, and I always use about a third to a fourth of it with cover crops every year. And I rotate that, of course, as I do my crops. But that enriches the soil, but it also attracts pollinators. So it's a twofold benefit. So yes, I think a lot of farmers use cover crops. There are all kinds of cover crops, clover, and so on and so on. But buckwheat is great because it matures quickly. It's beautiful. It's great for a small community plot like I have.
I can
Does
tell
that
you
also keep? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, just one comment to that. The big agro farmers don't use cover crops. They're the ones that are pouring the fertilizer in and trying to get the highest yields year after year.
And they don't do it. Huh?
Right. Well, they're in it for the money, and
that's right.
That's the bottom line. But I think a lot of the smaller farmers, especially those that have CSAs and so on, I think they do work with cover crops.
Oh, absolutely. I
Hey,
agree.
Lee and Richard, I noticed that Don Reeder's had his hand up a couple of times. If you wouldn't mind letting him get his question in.
Okay, I don't have any
Unmute yourself, Don.
ability to do
Yeah,
that.
well,
Unmute
the
yourself.
major thing is that we're talking about sustainability. And we have two incredibly complex and difficult problems. Increased population, which is blowing up, and increased climate, heat, which is going to affect the food. There is no question that there are difficulties in the complexity of this situation. We don't look at fertilizer as much as the distribution of food. Lee just commented about the distribution in Russia, which means they have the fertilizer, but they don't have the tubers, and that's going to affect their production.
Yeah.
So the point is that distribution and water, which, you know, when the Ogallala Reservoir runs out, U.S. is not going to be as big a producer as we have been. And things are going to change. And they're changing, which is exacerbated by the growth in population. So we don't fix the situation by fixing one component. We have to look at the overall components, and that is complex and difficult to do, but
Yes.
we should be doing it.
Mhm. That's right.
Good
Very
point.
complex.
I think this conversation should stimulate more people. I've been very gratified to all of you for volunteering to come forward and lead these discussions such as we're doing this year and this spring. I'd like to see it continue in the fall. Ulrich's question and comments were much appreciated. Ulrich, I invite you to lead a discussion about home gardens this fall if you can, or if you feel inclined. I think it would be, we could all learn a lot, even those of us who are a little old for digging a garden might get some people in to do some help. It'd be fun to, and a great experience for us. Many of us, I think, if we have backyards, to at least try a little gardening and have a look at different kinds of fertilizer and fertilizer substitutes we might use. It's a fun project.
Richard, never too old to garden.
Who said that?
Ulrich.
That's Ulrich. Good. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I did.
Say,
Great
Rich, I'm not an expert on any of this thing on food production, but my question is, there's no question that global warming is an incredible threat from all kinds of aspects with respect to the future for the world and for our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And it's been so well documented scientifically, including the recent report from the United Nations showing that it's going faster, and that much of it we're now have to look at adaptation and not just mitigation. My question is that this is a lot of new information to me that really looks like a doomsday scenario from these reports that Lee so nicely presented today. Has anyone validated a lot of these predictions, like global warming has been so nicely validated scientifically?
Well, I have other sources that I didn't include in this because the whole presentation was going to get too long. but I have article here from Chemical and Engineering News Magazine. This one was November 29 of this past year. The title is Fertilizer Prices Go Through the Roof. Okay. And expensive inputs and strong demand send prices skyrocketing in 2021. And I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but this actually shows can you guys see that?
No.
No,
Not
the
well.
slides are still up.
Oh. Do I do a stop share? Maybe. Let me try that.
Can you
Now
send
can you see?
that?
Can you see it?
Yeah. Can you, is that, do you have that in digital, a link to that digitally?
Well, CNA News, I think they do have an online source now, or I could maybe scan it in and send it to you, Richard.
Or, yeah, you could do that, or you could just, yeah, scan it in, maybe even just the summary or the first page or two. I don't think we have to do a long thing, but at least a summary and some of the key figures.
Oh, it's a whole article on half a page, more or less.
Okay.
And
yeah,
then
that
here's
would be
another
fun.
one also from Chemical and Engineering News. This is from January of this year. It says farm chemical prices shortages will reshape use. And they're saying growers worldwide are facing huge cost increases for fertilizers, and farmers in the US are having trouble securing supplies of critical herbicides. Those factors could reshape the way farmers use agricultural chemicals in 2022. Okay, so the answer to your question is yes, it is verifiable from other sources, and Chemical and Engineering News is pretty reliable professional trade
Yeah.
journal, I guess you might call it.
Yeah, why don't you send it
Chemist.
around, and I'll forward it to the group. Ulrich also sends a note. I'm looking here under the chat function, and she says a fertilizer that costs $15 for a 30-pound bag last spring, and this year that same 30-pound bag has gone from $15 to $25. So that's an interesting idea. Another, or not point, just a point of reference context. George Erickson sends a note that we've heard him say before, but it's worth repeating. He says, long-term solar only generates 20% of its rated capacity, with the rest being created by power plants that primarily burn carbon. It is not green. The capacity factor for wind is 33%, with the remainder being generated primarily by power plants that burn carbon, 20%, which means that it's also not green. BP and Exxon love wind and solar. The greenest, safest way to generate electricity is with nuclear power, which has a capacity factor of more than 90%, and it creates no CO2. So calling wind and solar green is common, but grossly inaccurate.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to agree with that. Yeah. And nuclear energy should be used as our base loading all the time, don't you think?
Yeah, there's a huge resistance to nuclear. The more I read this past few months, the more I see a split right down the middle of society. Those people who are seeing, particularly in the nuclear industry, that it's wonderful, and those people who are strongly opposed. China is building vast amounts of nuclear, but they're also continuing to build coal plants. So I guess they're just desperate for energy, and they want to keep all their.
I think one key point on that, Richard. I think China plans to substitute nuclear for coal.
Yes,
you know,
yes,
in their steam generation.
Yeah, that
systems.
is their goal.
Yeah, they want to, and so they're it's sort of a temporary thing, but
right,
it is there, and maybe they want to keep their population going.
Right.
It's dystopian to think you need all this fossil fuel to make fertilizer. That's really bothering me.
Yeah, me
right
too.
now, that we need the scale of that
Yeah.
to keep the fertilizer stream going.
I think
and everything.
But it's reality. Unfortunately, it's reality.
Yeah, but it's you think there are microbes and other systems there that can work in the background. I don't know.
I think we
That are
become
gonna be there.
over-dependent. I think we become over-dependent on fertilizers and we need to scale back.
Right, but people are gonna die when we scale back. That's the problem.
Yeah,
If I
I'd
may
like to
interject-
jump in for a second.
I'm
Sure.
not sure.
I come from a farm background and still have land that I farm and renters that farm some of it. Fertilizer in southeast Wisconsin, and I'm not talking at Menards or your local garden store, but fertilizer in bulk quantities is now triple the price it was a year ago.
Okay, and then you just verified Mike Adams'
Yes.
300% increase in fertilizer price.
yep,
Yes.
yep. I-
And these days you can't grow a crop that is profitable. And by profitable, I mean the cost to plant it in terms of equipment, fuel, just labor. You need a crop that is fertilized. If you just go out in the land without fertilizer and plant it, yeah, you'll have food, but you'll go broke very quickly.
Yeah, okay, that's a great point. I didn't,
And
that kind of wasn't covered in my talk, but that's a very, very good point.
Do you believe that applies, Stephen, even if you rotate crops, if you start with soybeans and then switch to corn or other crops, even with rotation, that you're still going to not be profitable?
You have to go soybeans, corn, alfalfa, soybeans, at least in a triple, and that means one crop every 3 years. That's food, because you just deplete the soil very quickly with corn. If you recall your history, maize by the Indians required that they build a hill mound, put a fish in it, put some corn seeds in it, and grow their crop with, quote, artificial fertilizer that they got out of the adjacent stream.
I would say that's natural.
We've been fertilizing for centuries. It's just the press of our population, in order to keep food economical, has required us to use artificially created fertilizers. We just have too many people for what the land can support naturally. We passed that a long time ago. And unless we do some things to naturally control population is going to control itself with famines. We're seeing that in countries that have population densities much greater than the U.S. And if you turn the TV on, you're going to see an advertisement for Feed the Children, and that's because despite the level of artificial fertilizers and genetically modified seeds, we can't, even without changing our practices, we can't feed the people we have today. We lose 1 million people to starvation over a year.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your remarks, Stephen, very much, and I think there's a lot of truth in them. We should be thinking, all of us, about continuing this discussion some more this spring in some of our broader discussions, and have any of you lead, and that includes you, Stephen, lead some discussion groups this fall. It's now 3 minutes after 11, and if I'm going to get in an even more depressing talk,
I knew that was coming.
it was called 6 degrees initially, and I've tamed it down to 4 degrees. And maybe I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, let's see if I can get them up. I'm not very good at this, but let's give it a try. And
Yeah, right now, Richard, I've lost all of your faces and all I see is my slides. And so I may have to get totally out and have to come back in. So watch for admitting me if you would, if I get totally out.
Okay, I'll do that. Meanwhile, for the few minutes, I'll be trying to get my slides up. I can see everybody here and I need to change that view and get it on a screen share. So I'll do that and I'll try and look for you, Lee. If not,
Okay,
I'll send-
I can see you guys now. I can see you
Okay,
now.
good. Let me try sharing the screen. There I have that one. Let's try this one. And I'm going to move this up and try and move that back. Let's see, how can I reduce? There we go. I think I've got that one there. Good. Then I come down here. Okay. Well, thank you again, Lee. Appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
This is a talk that I gave back in February the 28th to the people at Oakwood, and but it's taken from a book by Mark Linus written in 2008, and I presented this in 2014. But I see enough of you out there to know that a good number of you were not present for that 2014 meeting. So let me go right to the meat of it. The questions that Mark Linus was trying to deal with were how hot and how soon. And he raised the question, will we get to 4 degrees? He was asking 6 degrees by 2100. And I've added a couple of slides here at the beginning before we get into Mark's talk, because it's important in trying to understand how hot and how soon to look at the Keeling curves. I've mentioned them before. I think in Bill Gates' talk, I put this slide in, but it's a very important one dealing with not emissions, but with the ultimate result of our emissions, the actual carbon dioxide concentrations measured at Mauna Loa Observatory. And you'll notice that while it's difficult to guesstimate temperature, the CO2 concentrations and their rate of change does give us a glimpse into our likelihood of success or failure. And just as we are starving ourselves, we are also CO2 poisoning ourselves. If you look at this graph and notice that from 1960 to 2020, in that 60 years, the curve isn't going up to a plateau. It's still rising and increasing with time. So we're making things worse and worse for ourselves year by year. Now, why are we failing, you could ask yourself? And look at this modification of the Mauna Loa monthly averages by looking at these times of meetings, famous meetings held back in early 1970s. James Hansen's testimony to Congress in 1988, when we were at 350 and he said we shouldn't get any higher than that. We've actually had a famous group that a lot of people know about called 350.org based on Hansen's comments. And that organization is denying the utility of nuclear and doesn't want to learn about it. Then we come to the UN Framework on Climate, the Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen Accord, and Paris Accords. And in spite of that, they seem to be following along the comments made by George Erickson that everybody thinks we should go green, which is going 10,000 fold in the wrong direction instead of 1,000,000 fold in the right direction. So here is a curve that I find is quite interesting. It shows carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in versus global temperature. So it tries to relate these two things, CO2 and temperature, and it looks nicely here at where we've been from 1850 until 2020 or so. And they projected the curve, and the curve works that every time you double the amount of CO2, you increase the global average temperature by 2.3 degrees. And you actually see that if you go out here to 700 compared to 350 and so on, it actually goes up. That's a doubling of the CO2, and it goes up by 2.3 degrees. So this is also interesting. They superimposed on this curve dates here. You notice it's not an arithmetic date scale, but it shows what might happen with business as usual. We would probably continue to follow that curve. And that curve suggests a lot of global warming to come. Now, this table was taken directly from Mark Linus, and it's from page 279 of his book. And it's an interesting table. He tried to set a target and for CO2 concentrations on the right column, and he has the temperature change that might go along with that in the left column, and the action needed in the central column. And of course, in the first line, even back in 2008, he said, we can't afford that. We've already gone up a degree, hit 350 parts per million. Well, what about when we get to 400? We breezed by there a few years ago. And that's when that would be if our peak emissions were by 2015. And by the way, Mark used this term peak. It's really not a peak at all, unless you compress things. And even then, you won't find a peak. It's not going to go down for centuries. And so it should be plateau. And if we plateau our emissions by 2015, which we didn't, we went breezing along, then we would go up a couple of degrees. So let's try and plateau our emissions by 2030. Will we breeze by 450 parts per million? That's a good question, but that's already going to take us somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees. And will we breeze by 550 parts per million by 2050? We keep talking about going net zero, but that net is a funny word, and it should be an absolute emission cessation, and I don't think we'll ever get there. And so for sure, we're going to hit 4 degrees, in my opinion. I'm not sure if we get to 60. 60 is 6 degrees, I mean, that would be 800 parts per million, and that would be pretty bad. What I want to take for the thesis today is this idea that we'll get to 4 degrees, and we probably will get to 450 parts per million. Let's just look at this slide. In the past, if we look into times when it was a lot warmer in between various glacial periods, we found that when we passed 4.3 degrees, or 3.5, I mean, centigrade in the past, either in one direction, either going up or going down, at that temperature above today's temperature, most polar ice caps had melted, and the sea levels went up by somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 meters. That's about 150 feet. And half of humanity would have to migrate inland. Just take a little look at this map. Let's look for the state of Florida. It's gone. The delta of the Mississippi is underwater. Nova Scotia is almost gone. New Brunswick half gone. Newfoundland's still there. The Hudson Bay is huge. And fortunately, it looks like most of California and Mexico still will be there. It gets kind of thin around Costa Rica here. Look at these huge, the Amazon basin here. This river, Haranja, I think it's called, is inundated. The Amazon, of course, huge. Mediterranean Sea is not too much different. The Black Sea and some of these inland seas that are starting to dry up today will be inundated with oceans coming in. The UK looks pretty skimpy there. Ireland and England going to have some real estate loss. Pakistan and these parts of Asia will go underwater. Indonesia might hang on close to the volcanoes. Australia will take some big bites, and so on. Japan looks like it'll still be there, but more volcanic, not very much lowland, and so on. Siberia will be quite different too. So it's a map when you think half of humanity to migrate inland. It's not starvation, but it's inconvenient for sure. So getting down to his text, we're going to review through some of his slides and just try and update them a little bit. He pointed out that back in 2001, the Interplanetary International Panel on Climate Change projected a sea level rise of 2.2 millimeters per year. And here it is 20 years later, and our projections now are 3.4 millimeters per year based on that graph that I showed you, and they're projecting sea level is going to go up by 50% faster than we projected 20 years ago. If ice melts as rapidly as it did after the last ice age, global sea level will shoot up by 50 millimeters per year. This is interesting, 50 millimeters per year instead of 3.5. And that went on after the last ice age for 4 centuries. It was actually had a name in geologic time called the Meltwater Pulse 1A. And so that could very well happen. Our harbor monuments for over 1,000 years may disappear into the sea. Is this depressing? Yes, yes it is. Impacts of climate change are terrifying, but some may still be avoidable or made less severe. Getting depressed now is like sitting through a house fire instead of grabbing an extinguisher. Most people haven't the slightest idea what 4 degrees of average warming really means. When New York City was buried under a mile of ice 18,000 years ago, global temperatures were only 6 degrees colder. So use your imagination to contemplate 4 degrees warmer. And he points out the problem is difficult to try and pick dates. Says the world temperature could rise by 4 degrees by 2100, or if we're smart, it may take 2200. I think it's going to get there someday, no matter what we do, but it would sure be a lot nicer if we had another 100 years to adapt. And I think George Ericsson's point is we can adapt a lot faster if we stop ignoring and berating nuclear power, since it's so energy dense and carbon free to all intents and purposes. The crucial factor is the rate of temperature rise, since that will limit our ability to adapt. And I think, hearkening back to what Lee has said, yes, it's a tragedy to have people starving, but since we're not very good at controlling our birth rate, that might be allow those of us who survive, those of this species to survive, to adapt a little bit better. If we think of transient climate change, rather than just having it suddenly reverse, the ocean's thermal inertia slows our planet from stabilizing at a given greenhouse gas level. And I think the next 2 statements were rather interesting. He says it's also unknown what the political consequences of climate change might be. If China were to invade Siberia or India, or if India and Pakistan started a nuclear war, these would affect us profoundly, as we're already seeing between something we couldn't have imagined back in 2008, China and Ukraine at war. But he points out that the climate change is the canvas, or global warming, the canvas upon which the 21st century's history will be painted. I think that's a statement that's likely to be true. What we do not understand, this is a fascinating slide, and this is just a section of his book, summarized in 4 points. Science does not support political demands for 80% reduced emissions by 2050. We can talk about net zero all we want, but 80% reduced emissions is a big undertaking, and particularly at the rate we're doing it now, at the rate we're shutting down nuclear plants and continuing to build coal plants, at the rate that we're destroying the Amazon forests, we're just not going to get there by 2050. Reducing current emissions will not suffice. It is the cumulative emissions that really matter. And he comes to this interesting mathematical point that we don't think of very often by saying that total anthropogenic emissions must not exceed 10 to the 12th tons of carbon to limit warming to 2 degrees. Well, we're already halfway there, he says, and we'll miss this limit by 2045 if we continue with business as usual, or BAU. I stuck in this slide because it's just takes a look at our country, and this is a projection of damage between roughly between 60 and 80 years. And they look at the damage, the darker it gets, the redder and the darker it gets, is the percent of he says county, this is county by county, gross domestic product. And somebody said already this morning that we're in a pretty good situation here in southern Wisconsin. You can see that we're right at the merge of yellow and green here. So if you look down here where yellow and green is, it's just at this modest change county by county. There might be a 0 to 5% change in Dane County. But it's an interesting thing to look at. You don't very often see a map of this country with counties on it, and you can see that some of them are going to have a tough time. It's not limited just to Florida and Texas. There are quite a few others. I'm not quite sure why parts of Idaho and Oregon are going to suffer so much, but maybe you have some ideas you can share with us. Now we're getting, this is also not a direct slide. The map is new. He didn't have any maps in his book, but I put this map on just to help you know where Tuvalu is. You may have heard of it, I'm sure, at some of these climate meetings, but it's halfway between Kiribati and Vanuatu. I traveled back in 2010 from New Zealand up through New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands. And it was a fascinating trip where people even back in 2010 were getting concerned about ocean rise. But they have 5,000 inhabitants on there, and Kiribati has a lot more, 78,000 people in that whole atoll group. Maldives over in the Indian Ocean, 250,000 people, and other coastal inhabitants come to 500,000 people. So it's a lot of people who will sink and have to move. They say that already the young people are already leaving these islands, and the only people who are staying are the people who just can't, or too old to move, or for one reason or another, just don't want to undertake a migration inland. He talks about the Nile and mentioning that Alexandria, now a sprawling metropolis of 4 million, will slide under the sea by 2050. We think so often in terms of other parts we're more familiar with. I've never been to Alexandria, but I imagine it would be a very sad thing. We've already had, of course, the loss of the famous library, but to lose that metropolis under the sea would be really sad. Sea levels will rise by 1 meter by then, displacing 1.5 million people and submerging neighboring cities. Also drowning will be Bangladesh, Mumbai, Shanghai, Venice, London, Boston, and New Orleans. I haven't mentioned New York there, but that comes up on the next slide. Sinking of the Big Apple, he entitled this, 20 million people with 2,400 kilometers of coastline. That's a challenge. Superstorm Sandy gave New York City a foretaste, but the shoreline configuration really does promote storm surges. I didn't know this before, but there are 2,000 bridges and tunnels connecting these 3 islands that you see on the lower right. 3 flood barriers might be built, he said, that would cost millions, billions, but they might save lives and some property. It's difficult enough to imagine Florida going underwater, but New York City, that's quite something, and it really shows us how challenging that'll be. What will people do? Well, rebuilding a city could be an option once the water is pumped out, as we did after Storm Sandy. But that's if insurance will pay the price. And how often will they do that? Once or twice? The only long-term solution for millions of coastal dwellers will be to retreat inland. The social pressure from refugees streaming to relocate inland will be immense. Sea level rise will take millennia to stabilize, even after greenhouse gases have been controlled. So if starvation didn't make you depressed, this slide sure will. Influences on sea level, melting ice raised sea level 1.4 millimeters per year just 7 years ago. And now sea level is rising at 3.4 millimeters per year. When the Earth was last 4 degrees warmer, I said this before, there was no ice at either pole, and sea level was 50 meters, not millimeters, meters higher. The northern edges of the Ross and Rana ice shelves float sheer cliffs that are 300 meters thick. I'll show you that in the next slide. The big unknown is how much inertia remains in all that ice before 4 degrees melts all of it. This is an image. This is a map. And you see here, these ice shelves. Most of the western ice sheet is grounded below sea level, so this is all vulnerable. Central ice sheets in these areas, more central here, are losing over 100 cubic kilometers per year, and the melting rate is now 150 cubic kilometers per year. The western ice shelf could collapse at +4 degrees. It'll take a little more than that. These are mountains here, some of them volcanoes, and that'll take a bit longer than just 4 degrees. So there'll be part of that ice, I think, left after 4 degrees. 6 degrees, not so sure. This is more of a map. It shows that both these shelves, the so-called Rana ice shelf here, inland from the Weddell Sea, is about the size of Texas, and so is this Ross ice shelf. When there was no polar ice at all, they say, when it was 4 degrees warmer. What concerned me was these penguins. As you know, I'm kind of fond of penguins, and I imagine most of you are too. It's a very interesting creature, and they point out that if carbon emissions go unchecked, the global average temperature could rise 9 degrees Fahrenheit now. I wish they wouldn't use Fahrenheit. So that's 5 degrees by 2100, and that could doom more than 3/4 of the emperor penguins. These color codes are interesting. The deeper the purple, the more likely to become extinct. The lighter the purple, less likely to become extinct if we can slow it down to the current emissions. Beige color, endangered but vulnerable, and pale green, not vulnerable. Only one of these colonies of emperor penguins is pale green. All the rest are either endangered or likely to go. The reason I kind of focus on the emperor penguin is there are 18 species, as you know, and 17 of them are in the subantarctic islands in terms of breeding, but only the emperor penguin breeds here. The king penguin breeds over on the subantarctic islands, but and they do, the males do protect the eggs on their feet, both king and emperor. King penguins are only about 3 feet tall. The emperor penguin differs from the king penguin in that the adult does all of this rearing while the females go off to feed. With the king penguin, they both look after the eggs, but it's a minor difference, mostly by size and nesting behavior, but they're similar birds. The king penguin has a little more brilliant orange in this area, both beautiful birds. The rate of change is key. Antarctic ice sheets remain stable. If they do, much can be salvaged. However, if they melt rapidly, as they seem to be doing now, many meters of oceanic rise are in the cards. What about China? China has transformed itself from a peasant nation to an economic powerhouse in less than 20 years. Pretty amazing when you think of it. Population growth, soil and aquifer depletion, massive destruction of ecosystems could and probably will lead to a survival crisis. So even back then in 2008, Mark Linus had some inclinations of what Lee talked about earlier this morning. With an increase in 4 degrees, their food production could crash as crop yields decline. Other countries will be unable to help. The sands of Europe, he talks about cutting forests there, and they're doing that still in Germany to make more coal mines and coal plants. They're polluting oceans when we need them most. Southern Europe will have drier climates and hotter summers. I was preparing a talk, still am a little bit, for global impacts of glacier melting, and it was fascinating to read about the Alps and how they're making fake snow there already because of some snowless winters. The Caspian sea level will drop by 10 meters, but I think once the oceans come in, they'll go back up again. Wood rot in the Amazon forest, they point out, is a problem. I didn't see that in that article, but I didn't realize that as thoroughly as I did that Dottie sent around. But they point out that vegetation and soil bacteria work faster to break down organic matter. And that is kind of a problem, because if so much carbon from the methane of the breaking down of matter pours out, that the CO2 concentration will rise by 250 parts per million by 2100, boosting the temperature by just that alone by 1.5 degrees. Thus, the carbon cycle and positive feedback could tip us into a runaway warming by 2050. In 2005, a severe Amazonian drought showed us how it might happen sooner than we think. The trees there have no resistance to fire. Now he uses the term blighty. I wasn't familiar with this, but it's a British term, how they describe their own country. And he says, blighty will get a battering. Lots of cool weather will attract hot refugees, and greater winter storms may cause some flooding there. Millions of people in Wales, Monmouth, and Bristol may lose their home investments. And he adds a little joke, kids will have to go up to the Scottish mountains to build a snowman. The Thames flood barrier, I didn't even realize that was in, but apparently it was put in way back in 1983, and I was there in 1983. I didn't even hear them talk about it, but they have raised it 62 times since between then and 2001, and the feeling of the British is that it was money well spent. By 2080, once in a 150-year event will become a 1 in 7 event. Holland already protected may contract more. I remember going to Holland and asking the people what they thought about it. They're such good dam builders. They say, oh, it's not a problem. But in that map I showed you, I forgot to point out that Holland didn't exist. So I don't know, maybe whoever drew that map may not have realized that the Dutch were such good dam builders. We'll see. All regions above 50 degrees north will have more rain. Northern Europe may suffer floods and droughts in alternate years, as happened 20 years ago. And then in Siberia, as global temperatures rise by 4 degrees, the southern boundary of polar permafrost will shift north hundreds of miles, leading to unstable soils with collapsing roads and houses. It's already happening along the Trans-Siberian Highway. And Arctic ecosystems will dislocate more, while anaerobic bacteria will grow and release vast quantities of methane. It's a big potential tipping point that we haven't really thought about or planned. Feeding 8 billion, we talked a bit about that today. North Central USA will see milder winters with more winter wheat harvested. According to this one, they don't talk about, he doesn't talk about fertilizer. Floridian citrus growers will have less frost, so that's kind of nice for them. The Southeast will grow less soybean and sorghum. I guess it'll be too hot for that down there. The UK will be more successful at growing corn, berries, and zucchini, but Africa will suffer, and I think that's very true. Drought will be most deeply felt by the poor, and famine will occur in areas least responsible for climate change. We've seen that in many of the discussions that came out of Scotland earlier this year. The role of phytoplankton, I've used this little abbreviation, PTPL, so I have a little more room to type. These are the largest producers of calcium carbonate on Earth, and that, of course, removes carbon for the circulation as their limestone shells rain down upon the ocean floor to make future oil for people who may come along for eons from now, if any survive. Kay Richardson from Aarhus reminds us that phytoplankton absorbs half the CO2 we create, and it also generates half the oxygen we breathe, I could add. If we wipe them out, that process will stop and we alter ocean chemistry without knowing the consequences, a crucial tipping point. Other dire predictions, Australian drought and bushfires, they were predicting that in 2008, and we sure saw them in this last year. Super hurricanes near Houston, that's coming more and more often, and not just Houston, it's going right up the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. Melting Arctic ice will alter winds, drawing West Coast moisture north, but drying 11 Western states that'll have 30% less rainfall. That might be part of the reason for some of those black bars we saw in an earlier map. Central America will suffer dreadful droughts. Parts of India will have heavier monsoons, but I worry that some of those monsoons will release their rain before the winds from the Indian Ocean will even get to India, so they could lose their monsoons, would be an even worse thing. Pakistan and its neighbors will run out of water. Growing food in the greenhouse, we talked a little bit about that in earlier talks. He points out that all plants, especially grains, have a thermal tolerance threshold. Rice, wheat, and corn will yield 10% less for every degree centigrade above 30. Tropical crops will suffer most with drought. World food supplies will become precarious. Refugees will flood into more temperate areas. Conflicts will inevitably erupt into global social collapse, predicted by some as early as 2050. Sometimes wonder when I hear these talks if it might not be even sooner. Hansen has talked about the Albedo Flip, that is, as snow and ice melt, they become wet and dark with more absorbing of sunlight. This raises the temperature further, leading to more melting and a positive feedback. I took that picture in Greenland, but I think it represents some of the problems. It's a fascinating place to visit, but I'm glad I did it 10 years ago or so. I would feel guilty even going into the Arctic waters there. Every time we go up there, I think we contribute to loss of albedo. So I'm not sure I'd want to go back. But Greenland is warming 2.2 times the global rate. James Hansen, that is, claimed way back 20 years ago that 2.7 degrees is a regional threshold for 7 meters of sea level rise. Europeans argue this could be offset by more snowfall and thicker ice. This is a moulin, they call it, a meltwater plunging to the bedrock below. And as it does, it sort of lubricates the friction between the glacier and the rock and speeds up glacial slide. As coastal refugees move inland, crops and water supplies will be overstrained and civil wars will ensue. In densely populated Europe and China, isolationist survivalism will not be an option. Wow. Human populations will be drastically reduced as our planet tries to restore its balance. And now, this title at the top says, well, let me admit Steve Shellen. I think he came out, and I apologize, Steve. I didn't see that till now. Anyway, George raised a hand. Let me come back to you, George, in a few minutes. Since Kyoto, our CO2 emissions have gone up, not down. New discoveries of natural gas have lowered its price, making carbon-free sources less competitive. Will we be forced to bury our CO2 or apply other geoengineering tricks to our planet? Can we slow things down enough to adapt? Those are really good questions, and I think the whole idea of carbon capture and storage is going to be put upon us more and more. I see more and more conferences. I've attended a few digitally. I think George did too, and made some comments about that. I think we both agree that it would be an awful lot better if we could possibly avoid putting the CO2 there rather than having to try and take it out, especially if we tried to use so-called green energy to do it. Let me see now. Survival. As coastal refugees move inland, crops and water supplies will be overstrained and civil wars will ensue. Human populations will be drastically reduced as we try to restore our balance. Let's see if I can finish off these talks, because I'm just reading the old slides from years ago, but they're worth looking at. Since Kyoto, our CO2 emissions have gone up, not down. We know that. New discoveries of natural gas have lowered its price. Well, yes, until recently. We'll be forced to bury our CO2, will we, or apply other geoengineering tricks to our planet? That's a real challenge, still coping with. Can we slow things down enough to adapt? That's a key question. How can we do this? Well, worldwide, 60%, we need to have 60% emissions cut by 2030. That's sure not going to happen. And a worldwide 85% emissions cut by 2050. I doubt that too, but we can try. We might get a little wise between 2030 and 2050. Indians, I mean of India, emit 1 ton per capita. These are interesting statistics. Chinese emit 4 tons per capita, but we're still near the top. And of course, this slide is old, so it might not be quite that far apart, but we still do lead in our numbers are 20 tons per capita. Global Commons Institute proposed a contraction and convergence deal. I think I may have talked about that already. Nothing much has happened. And he asks this question, all this needs to be done, Mark Linus says, by 2015, and I added luck. Unique among animals, humans broke out of the ecological constraints of a finite solar energy budget by extracting the energy that was stored geologically in oil, coal, and gas. So fossil fuels, more than anything else, made us successful. And here we come back to this morning's talk. But our food system, for instance, is inefficient. It consumes 10 times more fossil energy than it produces in food energy. And this leads to various forms of climate change denial, including our blind faith in some kind of techno fix, such as using hydrogen. I think that was only at Oakwood. I showed this, the actual paper by Pakala and Sokolo in 2004. I was so impressed by that article. It was in the autumn, and it covered a lot of fascinating topics. But these two guys came up with what are called stabilization wedges, any 7 of which they had 15 wedges, and they described what we'd have to do for each wedge. And 7 of these 15 wedges, just under half, might have stabilized our emissions, not eliminated them, but at least it would have been nice if we could have stabilized them 20 years ago. Although I'm added this in, but we must cut to 0, we realize now. They illustrated the importance of scale. They understood that back then. To achieve 1 wedge with wind, for example, would require building and siting 2 million turbines that would cover 5 million acres or 3% of the United States. Instead, of course, we've raised our emissions. The human perspective in our efforts to make money, we restrict our outlook as an ant does for its colony. For a species that makes up less than half of 1% of animal biomass, we humans have appropriated a huge portion of the planet for our own needs. We must broaden our outlook and get serious about respecting the planet on which we live. So far, it's mostly talk and very little action. And I commented before on this Netflix movie, Don't Look Up. I imagine many of you have seen it. We were struck initially by the lack of serious political response to this recent movie. Gradual planetary destruction might not elicit the same psychological refusal to deal with a dying planet as a comet did. But the poorest countries will be the hardest hit. We see that, and we're already seeing more and more climate refugees. So what can we do? Well, we've already had Gates' lecture. He has pointed out the many causes, which was interesting, and the many solutions that need our attention. A growing opinion is that nuclear power is not dependent on batteries or other technologies yet to be discovered. It can be utilized now to generate heat as well as electricity, from which fresh water, cement, steel, and even plastic can be made without needing oil. We should look upon the discovery of nuclear power as our saving grace, not our downfall. We've got to teach somehow the half of the world or more, certainly half of this country or more, that are just dedicated to shutting down nuclear plants. This is a slide from Valerie Gardner, who runs an organization called Nucleation Capital, and people who want to invest in advanced nuclear reactors. This is one of her slides, a rather scary one. Perhaps some questions we should ask to people who deny nuclear energy. What if nuclear pollution is not as damaging as we are led to believe? What if the slightest whiff of radiation does not doom us to cancer? What if you dismiss the only solution to climate change and doom the world to another mass extinction event? What if your beliefs have been forged from incorrect data? What if you really are not smart enough or just too lazy to find out for yourself? Those are really powerful questions, and I hope that we put them to some of these people. I tend to be a little bit more of an easygoing guy. I like this slide. It says, a good friend backs you up, and you can see a solar panel going to sleep. He's got his nightcap on as the sun's going down. And friendly nuclear says, don't worry, I got you. And I think there is room for some solar and wind, some room, not covering acres and acres, but on small areas that can help out perhaps in some isolated communities, I don't know. But I think that for the Greens of the world to deny nuclear is a huge, huge mistake. So we've got some time now, 20 minutes for questions. So let me get rid of this slide.
I have one point.
Sure.
I don't know if maybe you made it, Richard, but this idea of ocean rise accelerating, when the Arctic has floating ice, and when that melts, it doesn't raise ocean levels as much as ice supported by land, such as Antarctica, Greenland, when they start to melt. And of course, they have thousands of feet of ice and glaciers. That's when it gets dicey. When ice is supported by land, it just really starts to raise the ocean, and it melts. It raises the ocean levels very quickly.
Yes, I think your point is well taken. Also, something that we haven't talked about very much is that, are you still there, everybody?
Yes?
Yep.
Good,
Yeah,
good. I'm just trying to get
Still
back
there,
to where I
still
was.
there.
Okay. I'm having a little trouble getting back to where I was, but basically something we haven't talked about, and that is that the water molecule expands as it gets warmer.
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
that contributes a lot to ocean
It
rise.
does.
And so it's not, you're absolutely right, Lou. It's not just melting of the ice. And
But yeah, that's a point people don't think of. It does
Yeah.
expand.
and also the CO2 in the air is readily picked up by the oceans and acidifies it. And it's the acidification that's going to wipe out the phytoplankton probably faster than the actual temperature. And so we've got to get serious about CO2. As I think George has mentioned, it's all very well to say, well, we can have a little bit of methane because it only lasts for decades. But the problem is, as it goes, it converts to CO2, which is staying around for centuries. So methane is a double-edged sword, and we shouldn't be too relaxed about it.
Richard, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said earlier that the last time the Earth was 4 degrees centigrade warmer, that the oceans were up 50 meters or 150 plus feet. Does that correlate with some of your earlier slides where you were talking about how many millimeters per year based on the temperature and based on the accumulation of CO2 within the atmosphere? If you measure that out, does it come to that 50-meter rise as was seen and documented when the Earth was 4 degrees centigrade or warmer?
That's a good question, Bing. And I went back and looked at those slides and carefully altered them so that they were consistent. The original slides that I had from Mark were not. And I think it was partly because I summarized them a little bit too much and didn't realize that some of them were projections. The other cautionary, but I have corrected them now so that they match and they fit the slides that are there. And so when this gets recorded, if you want to go back, you can check those slides. The other thing is that you have to take some of these maps with a certain amount of caution because it depends, I think, whether we were in an interglacial period and whether we were warming or cooling, because there's this basic resilience, not resilience, but momentum lag in the climate. And so in the planet. And so a map at a temperature that's increased by 3.5 to 4 degrees, if we are in a cooling phase or in a warming phase, they could look different. And so I think we have to be careful how we interpret those maps. But it still makes the point that when the poles do melt, and they will eventually, I'm convinced that we can't stop it now. I don't know. I don't say I'm convinced that on intellectual grounds. I'm not enough of a physicist, but I see so much evidence leaning toward the fact that we've started a trend that I just think without proof that the poles will melt. And when that happens, it's you can't argue with the fact that we're going to lose Florida and the Netherlands and a few other important parts of the planet where a lot of people like to live.
I have a question. Would Taiwan disappear if and China wants to take over Taiwan and is creating its own little islands, artificial islands?
The artificial islands.
What's the point of it? What's the point of that if they're all going to disappear?
That's just China. The big dictator countries like more land. They just like. And I think partly they're annoyed by it's the history. It's just like the problem Putin is having with the loss of the USSR. China is having never been happy with Chiang Kai-shek way back 100 years ago.
Well, two things on China. They put up the artificial islands to control the shipping passageways between China and Taiwan and actually out to Australia. that's the pinch point for shipping worldwide. So, but if the sea level goes up,
Yeah.
much of Taiwan will be underwater, but Taiwan is very mountainous,
Yes.
Oh, is it?
very
Well,
mountainous.
Yeah,
Just-
like you were saying, Richard, if they have volcanic activity and they're, they're erupting and adding more land, they'll be above the ocean. But,
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you look at the Hawaiian chain, we don't even realize that we're only occupying the easternmost 5 or 6 islands in the archipelago, and that's because they're freshly volcanic. And even Maui, which is a beautiful island, if you've ever been there, the midline channel between the two volcanic hills will be underwater, but people will still be able to maybe drive across a bridge from one volcano to the next. But the other islands that are mostly reefs now, they'll be sunken reefs. And
Yep.
so
Wow.
it's a fascinating idea to think of the
Yeah.
geography of the planet.
Yeah.
I think what be most upsetting for some people who like to vacation in Florida is to think of all the real estate there, all the happy retirees. Their home values are going to go down.
They are.
Not within their lifetimes because they're retired now, but their kids or grandchildren who want to inherit those homes could be losing a lot of home value.
Yep.
I wanted to say
Absolutely.
another thing, reason why China wants Taiwan is because of Taiwan semiconductor that makes
yeah.
the computer chips.
Yeah.
They desperately want control over that.
Yep.
And you can see how much that can affect our markets. I don't know if you've driven by Zimbrick or some of these big auto dealers through Madison recently. You notice that they've got their cars parked diagonally along the edge, and there aren't very many cars left. That's because of the computer chip shortage, right? Well, Taiwan Semiconductor, I think somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they are the second largest semiconductor producer in the world.
Yeah.
Something like that. Is that correct, Stephen?
They're either one or two.
I think they're way up there. They might be one.
Yeah.
Some of
And
those
whoever
up there.
controls those controls the world right now.
Where's the United States in that scheme of things? Pretty low, right?
They're trying to build
we-
back. They're trying
We
to
get the
build back.
majority of our semiconductors from Taiwan and South Korea, some from Japan, and we're dependent upon China also.
But they're trying to, I think Ohio, they're trying to build some really big plants to bring that back here in the US. I think they realize we can't be in this situation.
Yeah, Apple bought about 1,000-acre area in central Ohio to move some manufacturing back into the US.
And I think it's getting government support. It's getting some kind of, it was just voted on in Congress to get, and they have to bring that back.
Ohio legislature supported it.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course they would. But I think there's some federal funds coming.
Let me read some of the things that are coming in on chat for a minute, because we've just got 8 minutes left. The fertilizer shortage, this is from Lee. The fertilizer shortage arose quickly because of multiple forces: war in Ukraine causing Russia and other countries to stop fertilizer export, energy shortages to make fertilizer because of Russia raising prices of natural gas to Europe. Realize central banks are behind the wars because they make lots of money from wars. That's sad, but true. And she also adds, instead of forcing CO2 into the ground, why not just plant more plants that can consume CO2 and make food for us at the same time? That's good, but Bill Gates points out that that takes a while, and we don't have a while. You think he said it takes 40 years for a tree to grow up and produce, be a substantial tree that'll absorb that much CO2 and produce wood for furniture or something like that.
Yeah, but other crops could be planted
crops.
and they come up in a season, you know.
Yeah, but then they die and release their CO2 in the fall. So, but at least some of that CO2 that's released is in our bodies, so they feed us.
That's right.
It's a good point. Another one that Steve Schellen says, the present Antarctic ice sheet accounts for 90% of the Earth's total ice volume and 70% of its fresh water. It houses enough water to raise global sea level by 200 feet. That's an interesting statistic. Thanks for sharing that, Stephen. Let's see, what else do we have here? I think, another question was about the slides being available. This will probably be posted as a single webinar by PLATO probably within a week, and you can find it at platomadison.org. And if you look under recorded sessions, they'll show up. Tony's talk, I think, is already up from 2 weeks ago. I don't think Dorothy's on biodiversity is up yet, at least not last I looked. But she didn't have slides, but we still had a good discussion. Why did global fertilizer shortage arise so quickly, asks Lou. Do you want to answer that, Lee?
That was that answer that you just read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good. Yeah. And Tony says roughly 40% of US corn productions are used for ethanol. Very good point, Tony. We could, if we reverse that rule, the farmers wouldn't be very happy, but we sure have a lot more food. So it's just silly putting it into gasoline when you think of it in those terms. Let's see, what other questions? I guess that covers most of it.
Well, if we switch to electric cars, we won't need ethanol.
There you go.
That's the best solution.
So we've got two activities that we're promoting with government subsidies that are counterproductive.
Yeah. Well, the government subsidies to the oil industry are incredible, and how they have so much clout over the politicians is really sad to see.
They have clout because they have money.
Yeah. It's really.
So Richard, a couple other points as far as the ethanol. 40% of the U.S. cropland is corn. 30% of all the crops that we grow, acreage, is corn, and 40% is used on ethanol, unfortunately. And somewhere in the area of more than 35%, I've heard as high as 50% of the food that we grow is wasted somewhere in the process. It's fully inefficient the way we utilize the food that we grow within the United States, unfortunately.
So Tony, start building your compost heap for your garden.
Yeah.
Right.
We can last twice as long before we starve.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said, Stephen.
We can go twice as long before we starve.
Yes. Well, we won't be such an obese nation. We might have a lot less disease from cardiovascular, liver, whatnot, if we cut back on our diets. But yeah, so that's the one nice thing about, I don't know if you recall, when was it I gave that talk? I think it was last fall, maybe, on climate diet, I think it was, and I reviewed 2 books for that. And the idea was that if we cut back on beef and lamb, just those 2, or even eliminated those 2, it would be a lot gentler on the planet, and we could still manage pretty well with poultry and fish. And who knows, we might get around to eating crickets someday. The Orientals like them, and so I can't imagine it quite yet, chewing down on crickets, but they make them quite palatable, especially if you mix them in with some kelp. You'd have kelp cricket burgers. You don't need an awful lot of earth, and you know, the other thing we forget is that 70% of the planet is ocean, and we're not. You talk about wasting food. That's very true. We waste it in our growing, in the farms, in our delivery, and everything else, and then the grocers. After so many hours of sitting out there, they just throw it out, and I don't know where it actually goes to, but my guess is that most of it goes to landfills. But we overlook the oceans. The oceans could be a wonderful source of food, especially if we looked after them just the way we look after our land. Right now, it's a wild out there in the open oceans. And one of the things I got to say for Greenpeace is that even though they're vehemently anti-nuclear, at least they're helping to cut down on these factory ships that are around Antarctica harvesting fish. That's a terrible thing, and we do need to keep that stable. Do you have a question, Dottie?
Yes, I was going to say that we shouldn't look at the oceans. They're going to solve all our problems because we've been overfishing the oceans.
Yes.
So there's been like a 90% decline in major fisheries. So I think that we're overutilizing a lot of protein sources, overutilizing both land and sea resources.
Yes, I guess what I'm saying, and I didn't take enough time. I had a slide. Maybe I should send it around to you. Within the fish population, if you're eating only tuna, you're not doing the world any good. But if you're using one of the easiest fish, and lots of it left, is pollock. So you don't have to be a sardine fan. Pollock is a lovely fish, and there's plenty of it left in the ocean. But I basically agree with you, Dottie, that we are abusing the oceans at the present time. But we can learn, I think, through responsible fish farming to some degree and responsible fishing to another degree, to stop this long lines that we use in dredging along the bottoms of the ocean. I think that should be stopped. But just to care for the oceans, just like we care for the land. We're not doing it very well, but we can not only improve the way we use our land, but improve the way we use our oceans. So I agree with you that there are limits there, and in some areas we are overfishing. Couple minutes left. Any more thoughts? I do want to remind you, in case that some of you came in late, that Lou Hainish and I have arranged a trade, and so we've got, and I'll send out the new plan. But at the moment, we have George Erickson next week, review of the book Bright Green Lies. Mert Corwin will be speaking in April the 4th about methane sources, natural and human reduction options. And then I will.
Thinking about going solar? Before you do, see what others paid for 3.
I don't know what that was. Somebody came in.
That is.
Then I'll talk about global impacts of glacier melting on April the 11th, and I'm trading with Lou, and he will talk about big batteries and intermittent energy for April the 25th. So we're just reversing.
Corn-based ethanol. And in this video, we're going to explain why corn-based ethanol is a dumb idea to use for fuel in your car. Now, the permanence of corn-based
Somebody's telling us. Sorry.
Well, what about, speaking of fish farming, what about like tilapia? Is that that's a freshwater fish. It does need some kind of fertilizer. Doesn't it need some kind of fertilizer? But
Yes.
it's grown all over the world.
Yes.
Problem is it's got a lot of fat, undesirable fat in it.
Yeah, I just tried it recently. It's not my favorite fish by a long shot, but it does. I think if you look at the fish farming in general, it has taken a huge amount of pressure off of the oceans because much of it are wild caught fish from the oceans. But we have to be careful how we do the farming. I think some of it is better for it, and others not so much so. That's another whole talk.
Oh, I bet it is.
Maybe you can give it. Would you like to give us that talk, Lou, in the fall?
No, I don't know that. That's ground zero for me.
Okay.
Not at this point, but
I could try and look into it, maybe.
Yeah, it's kind of I would think it would take pressure off, but the ocean is so vast. You think it's hard to, if you manage it right, we could use a little bit more, get more out of it than we have.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's a good point. I've just written it down, Lou, as one topic, maybe for the fall. I'd like you all to think of that. I think already we're halfway through the spring season here, not quite halfway, but almost. And I think that we've done a great job so far of coming back to our roots of PLATO by having these discussion groups. And I think Dottie really got us back to the original with sending out some homework and then having it discuss it. That was a great model. But I like also the model of, we can hire in some professors now and again but I have no objection to that. But I like us as a group to get to know each other and have fun presenting to each other. So I encourage more of you to get back to me and we can start developing an agenda for this fall. So with that, I will say that I've again appreciate you, Lee, letting me a chance to squeeze in those slides from 3 weeks ago. And hopefully they'll be posted for people to look at. You guys have a wonderful spring. I think yesterday was the first day of spring, but today it's being recognized also. And see you all next week.
Two excellent,
Thanks,
though
Richard.
depressing talks. Thank you both very much.
They were, I'm afraid.
Thank
they
you,
were
Richard. And
Very
Louis,
thought-provoking. Very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Louis, just remember that there are more molecules in a cupful of water than there are cupfuls of water in the ocean.
How about that?
Yeah.
So if you dump a cupful of poison into the ocean, one of those molecules can be in every cupful that you take out later.
Very good.
Interesting thought.
Oh,
Interesting thought. Yeah. Okay. We'll have
Don't
to be
give
careful.
Putin any ideas.
yeah,
He
really.
drinks water too, even if it's in whiskey.
Not just vodka.
Vodka.
Okay, yeah, right.
Okay.
Vodka.
All right.
Okay,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
Thanks, Richard.
Have a great
Thanks
week.
for your time.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
Yes.
Thanks.
Have a good week.